The manila envelope landed on Audrey Sinclair's desk at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning, same as 100 other envelopes that week, same as the week before that. She was a paralegal at Whitmore and Associates, a mid-size family law firm in Ottawa, the kind of place that handled divorces with the same quiet efficiency that other offices handled tax returns. She had learned early in the job not to get attached to the files. People came in holding their lives in their hands, confused and grieving and sometimes furious, and Audrey's job was to help sort the paperwork, not the feelings. The envelope was for a new file. Client intake, preliminary discovery documents, a petition for divorce, standard. She opened it over her second coffee and began reading. The petitioner's name was Rachel Forsyth, 36, Vancouver-born, now residing in Ottawa. 2 children, ages 5 and 3. The respondent, the husband, was listed as Matthew Forsyth. Audrey set down her coffee. She picked up the page again. Matthew James Forsyth. Date of birth, March 14, 1983. Current address, 44 Briarwood Crescent, Ottawa, Ontario. That was her address. She read it a third time. Her hands were completely steady. That surprised her later. When she thought back on it, she would have expected them to shake. Matthew James Forsyth. Her Matthew. The man who had kissed her temple that morning before she left for work, who had asked if she wanted him to pick up groceries on his way home, who had called her odd since the first week they'd met and never stopped. The man she had been married to for 4 years. She sat at her desk and looked at the document for a long time. Someone walked past her office doorway and said something cheerful about the weather, and she said something back. She did not remember what. When she looked at the clock again, 11 minutes had passed. She closed the folder. She placed it in the center of her desk. She picked up her phone and texted her supervisor, Diane, that she needed to recuse herself from a file due to a personal conflict. No details. Then she stood, went to the bathroom at the end of the hall, locked the door, and stood at the sink with both hands on the cold porcelain. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Then she went back to work. She thought about this afterward, about how she went back to work, how she filed 2 other documents, attended a 2 p.m. meeting, answered 17 emails, and drove home in the October rain without running a single red light. People imagine that the moment of finding out is the moment you fall apart. But Audrey had spent 6 years in family law. She had sat across from enough women in that first raw moment of knowing to understand something they had all figured out the hard way. Falling apart doesn't help. Falling apart is a luxury you cash in later, when it's safe. She had grown up in a small town outside of Kingston, the youngest of 3, raised mostly by her grandmother after her parents split when she was 7. Her grandmother, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Bet, who grew tomatoes on the back porch and never said anything she didn't mean, had told Audrey once that the most important thing a woman could do in a crisis was slow down, not stop. Slow down. Think first. Move second. Audrey had been thinking since 9:14 a.m. By the time she pulled into the driveway, she had a plan. She did not tell Matthew what she knew. She sat across from him at dinner, ate the pasta he'd made, listened to him talk about a client meeting, and asked exactly the right number of questions to seem present. He was a financial planner. He had his own practice, a good reputation, memberships in the right professional associations. He was charming in the way that people in client-facing roles often are, instinctively warm, quick to mirror, good at making whoever he was talking to feel like the most important person in the room. He had made Audrey feel that way once. On some days, still. She smiled when he smiled. She said goodnight when he turned off his lamp. She lay in the dark and listened to him breathe. She had known Matthew Forsyth for 6 years. They'd met at a mutual friend's housewarming in the Glebe. One of those crowded parties where you end up in the kitchen because the living room is too loud. He'd been leaning against the counter with a beer he wasn't really drinking, looking slightly tired of the whole thing, and she'd said, "You look like you're calculating the earliest acceptable time to leave." And he'd laughed, a real one, caught off guard, and said, 45 more minutes. I've already said hi to everyone I know." They talked until the party ended. He called 2 days later. Within a year, they were living together in the Briarwood house. The wedding was small, immediate family, a dinner after at a restaurant she loved on Elgin Street. No fuss. Matthew said he hated fuss. She had thought that was a good sign. They had talked about children with a mutual vagueness that she now understood differently. Maybe in a couple of years. Let's get settled first. The practice is busy, there's time. Always there's time. She had believed him. She had been 32 when they married and knew the window wasn't infinite. But she'd trusted his steadiness, his certainty, his apparently unshakable conviction that they were on the same page. She had never thought to question what pages he was reading elsewhere. It started with the envelope, but the looking started the night after. She waited until he left for work the following morning. Then she sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and a second cup of coffee. And she began, and carefully, methodically, the way she approached discovery in any file. She was not looking for something to wound her. She was looking for the shape of the truth. It took 2 hours. The second email account was not even particularly well hidden. A variation of his name, an old university address he'd kept as a backup, accessible through a browser tab he must have thought he'd closed. He hadn't. She found it on their shared laptop, the one in travel, booking, and online banking. The password was the name of the street he grew up on, the same password he used for everything, the one he'd told her years ago because they had no secrets. The emails went back 3.5 years, 3.5 years of Rachel, of I miss you and the kids are asking where you are and when are you coming back, of photographs, the children, small and bright-eyed, a boy with Matthew's exact jawline and a girl who had his coloring, dark hair, light eyes, a family photo from what looked like a camping trip. Matthew in a fleece jacket, a child on each shoulder, laughing at whoever was behind the camera. He looked completely at home. He looked like a man who had never been anywhere else. The boy in the photo was 5. She did the math without meaning to. He was already a father when they got married. She sat with that for a while, not the betrayal, though that was there, heavy and airless, but the particular architecture of it. He had not drifted into another relationship. He had not made a mistake in a weak moment and tried to get back on track. He had built a second life, a first life actually, and folded Audrey into it as something else entirely. What exactly, she wasn't sure. A cover, a parallel, a version of himself he wanted to keep. She thought about the housewarming, the kitchen. 45 more minutes. Had he been hiding Rachel even then? She closed the laptop. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard, the garden she'd put in 2 summers ago, the raised beds for vegetables, the perennial border along the fence. Matthew had helped her dig the beds. He'd complained about his back the entire time, and she'd laughed at him. She had a photograph of him somewhere, muddy-kneed, grinning. She'd thought it was one of her favorite pictures of him. She went back to the kitchen table. She opened the laptop again. 2 hours after that, she called her friend Justine, who was a family lawyer in Toronto and had been Audrey's closest friend since law school. "I found something," Audrey said. "I need you to walk me through what my options look like." Not as a friend, as a lawyer. Justine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me everything." She flew to Vancouver the following Friday. Matthew thought she was visiting a client's family on behalf of the firm, which was the kind of cover story that works when you are married to someone who has never had reason to doubt you. She booked the flight on her personal card, using points she'd been accumulating for years, for a trip they'd never gotten around to taking. The irony of that was not lost on her. Rachel Forsyth lived in Kitsilano, a neighborhood of older houses and tall trees close to the water. Audrey sat in a rental car across the street on a gray Saturday morning and waited. She was not sure what she expected to feel. Rage, maybe, or the kind of cold that comes from seeing something terrible made concrete. What she actually felt when the door opened was something quieter and more complicated. Rachel came out with both children, the boy running ahead to a small blue bike locked to the porch rail, the girl on her hip, a bag over one shoulder. She was ordinary in the way people you've built up into monsters never are. Medium height, dark coat. She was talking to her son about something, nodding, adjusting the girl on her hip, the automatic multitasking of someone who had been doing this alone for a long time. She looked tired, not defeated, just the kind of tired that accumulates. Audrey watched her load both children into the car. She watched her check the car seats twice before getting in herself. She watched her pull out carefully, signal even though the street was empty, and drive away. She sat there for a while after the car disappeared, Rachel did not know. She was certain of it. You do not signal on an empty residential street and check car seats twice when you are consciously participating in someone else's destruction. Rachel Forsyth believed she was in a long-distance relationship with a man who was working toward bringing his family together. She had been waiting, and waiting, and waiting. On the flight home, Audrey did not look out the window. She made a list. When she got back to Ottawa, she made 3 calls. The first was to Justine. The second was to the HR manager at Whitmore and Associates to update the recusal on her file with a brief factual explanation. The third was harder. She called Rachel Forsyth. The phone rang 5 times. She had almost decided on voicemail when someone picked up, voice slightly guarded, not recognizing the number. "Hello. My name is Audrey Sinclair," Audrey said. "I'm calling about Matthew Forsyth. I'm his wife." There was silence on the other end. Absolute, complete silence. Audrey waited. Then, his wife. Not a question. Something flatter than that. "Yes," Audrey said. "I have to accuse you of anything. I'm not calling to accuse you of anything. And I think you deserve to know what that situation actually looks like. I'd like to tell you what I found, and then I'll let you decide what you want to do with it." Another silence. Longer this time. "Okay," Rachel said finally. Her voice had changed, gone careful, and controlled in the way that Audrey recognized, because she had done the exact same thing herself 3 days ago, sitting in a bathroom in Ottawa. The voice of someone deciding not to fall apart yet. Audrey spoke for 15 minutes. She laid it out clearly, sequentially, the way she would present discovery in a file. The email account, the photographs, the timeline, the dates that did not add up, the marriage certificate she had pulled from the public registry, dated 2 years after Rachel's son was born. When she finished, the line was quiet for a long time. Then Rachel said very quietly, "I asked him so many times." "I know," Audrey said. "He always had an explanation. He did. What does he think you know?" "Nothing yet," Audrey said. "I wanted to talk to you first." Another silence. Then Rachel exhaled, a long, unsteady breath. "What are you going to do?" "I have a lawyer in Toronto," Audrey said. "She's very good. And I'd like to connect you with a family law specialist in Vancouver who handles exactly this kind of situation. Fraud paternity support. You and your children should be protected in whatever comes next. That's why I called you before I called him." The silence on Rachel's end was different now. Softer somehow, like a door opening slightly in a very dark room. "Thank you," Rachel said. Her voice had cracked just barely on that second word. "I know," Audrey said simply. Matthew came home that Sunday evening, with takeout from the Thai place she liked, and a story about the drive through the Gatineau that she listened to with the focused, courteous attention she had developed over years of client interviews. He was good at ordinary life. She had always thought that was one of his best qualities, the ability to find comfort in routine, in the regular texture of a weeknight. She understood now that this skill had been honed across more than one household. She watched him put the containers out on the counter. She watched him pour them both sparkling water. She thought, "How many Sunday nights have you done this exact thing in 2 different kitchens?" She said, "Dinner looks great." He smiled. "Of course it does." She left 4 days later. She had planned it the same way she'd planned everything else, carefully, without rushing. Her professional records, her financial documents, the wooden box her grandmother, Bet, had left her with the small pieces of jewelry inside, her books, the ones that actually mattered, the window herb pots she'd propagated from cuttings. She took the raised garden beds too. She had built them herself, and she wasn't leaving them. She left one thing behind, the camping photo she'd found in the email account, printed on plain paper, placed on his pillow, and beneath it, a note in her clearest handwriting, the kind she used for legal documents. "I know about Rachel. I know about the children. My lawyer will be in touch." She did not include anything else. She had thought about it and decided that anything more was words spent on someone who had not earned them. Justine had already filed the petition. He called 11 times the first day. She did not answer. On the 12th call, she picked up. "Aud, please, just listen," she said. "I've been listening for 4 years, Matthew. I have documentation that predates our relationship. My lawyer has documentation. Rachel's lawyer has documentation. There is nothing you can explain that the paper trail hasn't already explained for you." She could hear him breathing. She could almost hear him calculating, the way he did, the way she had once found endearing because she'd thought it meant he was careful. It meant something different now. "This is not what it looks like," he said. "It's a legal matter now," she said. "Please direct further communication to Justine LeBlanc." "You have her number." She hung up. The proceedings were not fast, because they never are, but they were thorough. The financial irregularities surfaced during disclosure. Money moved through the practice in ways that did not survive scrutiny, some of it toward the Vancouver household, some of it less traceable than that. His business partner, a careful man named Ward, who had been with the firm for 12 years, found out during the audit and spent 3 days going through the books before he said a single word to anyone. Then he submitted a formal report to the provincial regulatory body and changed the practice's letterhead. Matthew's professional reputation, once built on referrals and consistent results, did not survive the disclosure. The regulatory investigation took 8 months. His client list shrank first by the people who read between the lines, and then by the people who read the actual findings. He ended up selling his share of the practice at an assessed value that did not reflect what the firm would have been worth 12 months earlier. He moved into a rental on the outskirts of the city, somewhere east of the Greenbelt, a long commute from everything he'd built. Audrey heard about most of this secondhand through Justine, and then through the documents themselves. She had stopped looking for information about him that she hadn't specifically requested. It wasn't that she didn't feel things. She did. Some days she felt them quite loudly, but she was good at deciding which rooms to open and which ones to stay out of for now. She moved into a smaller place in the glebe, not far from where they'd first met, though she didn't think about that much. Ground floor, a small backyard where she reinstalled the raised beds in March. The soil still cold and half frozen when she turned it. She grew tomatoes from seed for the first time the way her grandmother had. They were not ready until September, and they were not perfect. She ate them standing at the kitchen counter, still warm from the afternoon sun. Justine came up from Toronto on a long weekend in April, 4 months after the filing, and they sat on Audrey's small back porch with wine until the temperature dropped enough to make them go inside. Justine had known Audrey since they were 23 and studying for the same exams in the same bad lighting, and she had a way of sitting with difficult things without trying to resolve them prematurely that Audrey had always valued. At some point, Justine said, "How are you actually doing?" Audrey thought about it honestly. "Better than I expected," she said. "Worse on Tuesdays, for some reason." Justine said, "Tuesdays are genuinely the worst day. I think I'm angry," Audrey said. "But the anger is useful right now, so that sounds healthy," Justine said. "I have no idea if it's healthy, but it's functional." They laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from being known well enough that you don't have to explain the punchline. She heard from Rachel 3 months after the initial call, not about Matthew. The email was careful and brief and made it clear that Rachel was not interested in rehashing anything either. What she said essentially was this: "I don't have many people in my life who understand what this specific thing was, the particular shape of it, and I have a feeling you might be one of the only people who does." Audrey read it twice. Then she replied. They met in Vancouver the following month. A coffee shop in Kitsilano, walking distance from Rachel's house. Audrey flew in on a Saturday morning and felt, as she landed, a specific strange to a city where she had sat in a rental car and watched a stranger's ordinary life, as though she were surveilling a crime scene, which, in some ways, she had been. Rachel was already there when she arrived. She looked different from the sidewalk surveillance, which Audrey felt slightly embarrassed thinking about now. She had a directness about her, a quality of sustained attention, the kind that comes from raising children alone and having to be 2 people for a long time. They ordered coffee. They were both a little awkward for the first few minutes. Then Rachel said, "Can I show you a picture of the kids?" And Audrey said, "Yes, please." And somehow that was the thing that broke the ice entirely, because they both laughed at themselves a little, at the absurdity and the tenderness of it. The boy was named August, which Audrey thought was a perfect name for a 5-year-old who apparently had strong opinions about dinosaurs and was learning to ride a bike. The girl was Nell, Not yet 4, currently obsessed with a particular stuffed rabbit she carried everywhere and insisted slept under the covers. They talked for 2.5 hours. Mostly not about Matthew, about Rachel's work. She was a graphic designer. About Audrey's early years in law school, about Ottawa winters and Vancouver rain, and the specific loneliness of being a single parent in a city where your family is far away. Rachel's parents were in Halifax. She had friends here, good ones. But the kind of exhaustion that came from managing everything alone was its own category of hard. I would have left sooner, Rachel said at one point. If I'd known, the moment I knew, I would have left, Audrey said. He was very good at it. Yes, he was. They paid for their coffees. They walked along the seawall for a while, in the November gray, hands in their pockets, the water flat and cold beside them. They did not make specific plans to meet again. They exchanged numbers. On the Uber to the airport, Audrey looked out the window at the mountains, barely visible through low cloud. She thought about Matthew in his east of the Greenbelt rental, moving through rooms that didn't fit him. She thought about August and Nell. She thought about Rachel walking back to her house on that street in Kitsilano, letting herself in, starting dinner. She thought about herself. There was a version of herself she had been carrying around for the last 5 years. A version that had made herself quieter and more agreeable than she naturally was, because she'd believed that was what partnership required. A version that had stopped talking about moving to a bigger city, because Matthew's practice was here, that had stopped saying what she wanted in any room where it might cause friction. That had let herself be shaped around the edges by someone else's preferences, the way wood gets worn smooth into places it's handled most. She had thought that was compromise. She understood now it was something else. She was a good paralegal. She was also, she knew, good enough to become a lawyer if she chose to. She had known it for years. She had just had reasons not to. Some of those reasons had been real. Some of them had been borrowed from someone else's picture of their life together. She enrolled in the part-time law program at the University of Ottawa in January. She told exactly 3 people before she started. Justine, her grandmother Bet in Kingston, and Diane at Whitmore & Associates, who said, "We've been waiting for you to do this," and smiled in a way that was annoyingly correct. The divorce was finalized in the spring, clean in terms of documents. Harriet's network had also connected Rachel with the Vancouver specialist, and the support and paternity proceedings ran parallel. Matthew's financial exposure between the 2 cases and the regulatory findings was substantial. What he had built across 2 households and 1 compromised practice had required money that he had not been transparent about anywhere. He was not untouchable. He had believed he was. He had been wrong. Audrey signed her copy of the final order on a Friday afternoon. She sat with it for a moment, alone in the small office she shared with a colleague who was out that day. The sun was coming in sideways through the window, the way it does in Ottawa in May, low and very bright. Outside the window, the street was ordinary. People going past with coffee. A dog waiting outside a shop. She read the order one more time. Then she filed it in the appropriate binder, placed the binder in the appropriate cabinet, and went to put the kettle on. She was in the kitchen at work when he found her. Someone else entirely. His name was Frederick Okafor. He was a barrister from Toronto, in Ottawa for a federal court proceeding, borrowing a spare desk from Whitmore's for 2 weeks because his firm's satellite office was being renovated. He had been in the building for 4 days before they actually spoke, which happened because they arrived at the kitchen at the same time, and both reached for the last of the coffee at the same moment, and he said, with perfect seriousness, "I yield." "You look like you need it more." She laughed. "More than I have in a while," she said honestly. He poured the rest of the pot into her mug. "That's either very kind or very strategic," she told him. "Let's say both." They ate lunch together that day, in the small park down the block, because the weather was finally warm, and neither of them wanted to be inside. He had a precise and funny way of observing things, the kind of intelligence that works by noticing rather than explaining. He listened well. He asked questions that were actually interested in the answer. He told her he had a younger brother named Kwame, who was still catastrophically better at tennis than him, despite Frederick having a good 5 inches on him. He told her about the particular challenge of practicing federal administrative law in a country where the administrative landscape kept being renegotiated out from under you. He asked about paralegal work versus law school and whether the gap between the two was as specific as it looked from outside. She told him it was more specific and also less important than people assumed. He said, "What's the less important part?" She said, "The credential is the entry point, not the ceiling." He looked at her in a way that felt direct without being aggressive, like he was paying attention and had no reason not to show it. She had not felt that in a long time. They did not have dinner that week or the week after. He was in and out of court. She was in the thicker part of the semester. The logistics did not align. He left a coffee on her desk one morning with a post-it note that said, "In case the kitchen runs out." She found it at 8 a.m. and stood there, holding it for a moment before she sat down. He was there for 3 weeks total. On the last day, he stopped by her office on his way out, bag over his shoulder, and said, "I know I'm leaving today. I also know that Ottawa is 45 minutes from the airport, and the train to Toronto runs 4 times a day." She looked at him. She thought about the things she had let herself not say for 5 years. She said, "I know those train times too." He smiled then. Not a performance of a smile. The real kind, the kind that reaches before the person has decided to let it. He called that Thursday. His voice on the phone was the same as it was in person, unhurried, paying attention. They talked for an hour and a half. He told her about the view from his office in the St. Lawrence Market neighborhood, and she told him about the tomatoes she was growing from her grandmother's seeds, and he said, very seriously, "How are you defining success on those?" She said, "If I eat one of them before September, I'll consider it a triumph." He said, "That's a good standard. Don't let anyone lower it." She met him in Toronto on a Saturday in July. He had suggested a restaurant in Kensington Market, the kind of place that was clearly a regular choice rather than an impression-making one, which she thought was exactly the right signal. He was already there when she arrived. He stood when she walked in. Not a performance, just the simple, actual instinct of someone glad to see you. 4 hours, good food, a walk after, through Kensington in the evening light, the neighborhood unhurried and slightly chaotic around them. She told him, carefully and without dramatizing it, enough of what she had been through that he understood the shape of the year. He did not rush to fill the space after she finished. He walked beside her for a moment in silence, and then he said, "I'm sorry you had to work that hard just to get back to yourself." She felt something shift, not the sudden drop she remembered from when she was younger and called it love, something different. The sense of solid ground after a long time of watching where you stepped. He walked her to the train station. They stood at the entrance. It was late, the summer dark soft around them. He said, "I'd like to do this again. As many times as you want to, for as long as you want to." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the woman she was becoming, the one who said things, the one who did not let herself be shaped by someone else's silence. "Yes," she said. He leaned forward, the question in his eyes clear and patient, and kissed her once gently on the cheek. She smiled the whole train ride home. It was not fast. Neither of them wanted it to be. She finished her first year of law school. He took the train to Ottawa on alternate weekends through the winter, and she went to Toronto when her schedule allowed it, and they built something out of the slow accumulation of ordinary time. Coffee and Saturday mornings and the specific joy of knowing exactly how someone takes their tea. The way he remembered things she'd mentioned once in passing. The way he called when he said he would. The way his voice on the phone at 10 p.m. felt like an exhale. She called her grandmother on a Sunday evening in March, 8 months in. Bet listened to everything without interrupting, which was her way. Then she was quiet for a moment and said, Does he slow down? What? Does he slow down when it matters? Does he slow down or does he rush through?" Audrey thought about it. "He slows down," she said. Her grandmother said, "That's the one." Then she asked about the tomatoes. Frederick proposed in October. Not publicly, not with an audience. They were in her backyard in Ottawa on a Saturday afternoon, sitting on the back steps while the last of the garden came down for the season, drinking tea that had gone slightly cold. He turned to her and said her name once, quietly, and she turned, and his expression was entirely open. No calculation, no performance. Just Frederick, looking at her the way he always looked at her, like her answer was the most important thing in the room. He said, I want to build a life with you. I want it to be unglamorous and real and full of cold tea on back steps and tomatoes from your grandmother's seeds, and the particular satisfaction of a thing that took a long time and turned out right. I want to be someone you can rely on completely. I've been thinking about how to say this for 3 months, and that's all I've got." Her eyes filled without her deciding to let them. She said, "That's everything." "Yes," he said quietly. She said yes. The wedding was small. Justine came. Bet came, straight-backed and sharp-eyed as ever, and pulled Frederick aside before the ceremony, and said something to him in private that Frederick refused to disclose, but that left him smiling for the rest of the afternoon. Rachel sent a message from Vancouver that said, "I couldn't be happier for you. I mean that from the very bottom of it." Audrey read it standing outside the venue in the October sun, in her grandmother's earrings, holding flowers she had chosen herself. She sent back a single line, "I know you do. Thank you." It was 2 years after the wedding that Frederick came home to find her at the kitchen table, not moving, staring at something in her hands. He said her name once. She looked up. Her eyes were full. She held up the test. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and wrapped his arms around her from behind, his face pressed against her hair. She could feel him trying to steady his breathing. She understood. After a while, he said, muffled, still not letting go, "Is this?" "Yes," she said. He made a sound she had never heard from him before, something that was not quite a word. His arms tightened. They stayed like that for a long time. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which Audrey found quietly miraculous given how complicated everything else had been. She finished her 2nd year of law school in the spring. Frederick drove her to every appointment, always early, always with the parking already sorted out, always with a coffee she hadn't asked for. That was exactly right. She thought about this afterward as one of the small measures of a person. The unremarkable logistics of care, repeated without acknowledgement, never skipped. The baby was born on a Thursday in November, into a room that was warm and loud and full of people who loved her before she had a name. They named her Bet. Justine, who had flown in from Toronto, stood in the hallway outside the room and pressed her hands over her mouth and cried in a very undignified way that she later insisted was entirely composed. A plant arrived from Rachel with a card for the beginning of everything. Frederick held the baby while Audrey slept. She woke once in the early hours and saw him across the room in the chair by the window, Bet against his chest, his large hand covering most of her small back, his face bent over her in the lamplight. He was talking to her in a low voice, not for any audience. Just talking to his daughter, introducing himself, starting the long work of being. Audrey watched them for a moment. She thought about the manila envelope on a Tuesday morning, about the name on the page that had stopped the world, about the woman who had driven home without running a single red light, who had made a plan before the grief had finished arriving, who had built something new out of the rubble of a life that turned out not to have been hers. She thought about her grandmother's raised beds, replanted in different soil. She thought about the word slow. Frederick looked up and found her watching him. He said nothing, just looked at her in the way he always did, like she was the first thing worth looking at in any room. She reached her hand toward him across the quiet. He took it without hesitation. Outside, Ottawa was dark and cold, and entirely itself, the river moving somewhere beyond the city lights, the night unhurried and long. And in that small warm room, with the people she had found on the other side of the hardest year of her life, Audrey Sinclair, almost a lawyer, daughter of Bet, wife of Frederick, mother of the small sleeping thing between them, had not understood that the life she was living now had not simply replaced the one that broke. It had never existed before. She had made it from the ground up with her own hands, that made it entirely, irrevocably hers.